Okay, first off, are there any questions or comments or anything from so far? So we can sort of get caught up. Well set. Okay, looks like everyone's here. Last time I was talking about this whole thing of bias, which is the first panel in the PowerPoint. As I think I've sort of finished up with is Polynesia in particular, and Hawaii, of course, not being folded into that, is a real key part of all this. You can't understand how the rest of the world has seen Hawaii, and more specifically, the concept of Hawaiian becomes redefined after European, quote, discovery of Hawaii in the 1770s. And that's a very, very complicated process, but it also drives tourism in the 21st century. It drives why Disney makes a movie called Moana. All this stuff is tied to European views of us as us in the context of Pacific Islanders in this part of the Pacific. Now, what it also means, if you're from some other part of the Pacific, for example, if you're from the Vanuatu, Vitilevu part of Fiji, so you're Melanesian, or you're from the Western Pacific, like Nouvelle Caledonie or the Solomons or something like that, you're a Pacific Islander, but you do not have the same, the Europeans didn't have the same view of you, and in the 21st century, they still don't have the same view of you. So it's sort of a strange phenomenon. We're going to spend some time going through it because it largely shapes even how Westerners and especially even universities see Polynesians and specifically Hawaiians in the 21st century. And because it's been going on for such a long period of time, basically 3 centuries, it also shapes how these folks see themselves and how they see each other. So let's go through this, and I'm going to try to find my visual aids here, but if I sort of screwed up, I'll pre-apologize for it. When you're looking at all this stuff, what you have to remember is people see the world from the point of view that they're comfortable with. And again, this is that ethnocentrism I mentioned last time. We judge the world based on what we consider to be normal. And so anything that's exotic or different is always viewed within that context of what we consider norm. There was a really weird but pretty funny movie that I think Burton did years ago, where these little green Martians invade the world. I can't even remember. I think Mars Attacks or some bizarre movie like that. Here I got some free time at night, watch it. Because what it really is actually more of a commentary on how people on Earth, in his case, specifically largely Americans, deal with something that's totally out of their context. The first thing they do is they try to put it into their context. So as I remember, the president of the United States start talking to the Martians like he can do a deal like they're a senator from North Carolina or something like that. He doesn't see them as something totally different who has a different mindset. He just sees them as being a version of himself. And that's how we all operate. If we go somewhere else, we always look at that group within the concept of norm. When I won't be going there for a while, but when I was doing research in China, you go to China, and on one hand, you realize that Chinese are different. On the other hand, you always have this sort of baseline assumption that Chinese really aren't that different. They're just sort of like folks from Hawaii, except they speak a different language and da-da-da-da-da. But the reality is Chinese society is totally different. It has no basis in Western logic. It's an entirely different logic system. And you get caught out. You'll be talking to someone else and they'll say something and be like, whoa, hold it, what the hell? Or they'll do something and you're just sort of like freaking out. Or they'll just sit there and stare at you because they expect you to do something and you have no idea what the hell's going on. So it's in that context that you have to understand when Europeans bumped into folks from outside of Europe, they basically scored them compared to themselves. Now, not surprisingly, because every group's ethnocentric, and especially Europeans at this time were hugely ethnocentric because it was tied into their religion that made them better. They weren't going to look at someone else and say, oh, Angelica is as good as me. They're going to look at another group. They're going to score her in terms of where she fails that they're good at. So she's always going to be at the 50th percentile, 80th percentile, sorry. But you're never going to be as good as them because their attitude is they went and found you, you didn't go and find them. It's a weird attitude, but you just sort of got to buy into that logic. So this is the European period of exploration. It starts in the 1400s. You could argue the Crusades were actually sort of the start of this. By the 1600s, the Europeans have, quote, discovered the Americas, largely driven by the Spanish. And so in this context, what happens is you start to get two discussions. One is this fascination with Indians, i.e. Native Americans. And initially, they see them as something close to equals. Let's see if we can find the equals one here. I don't know if you can see these pictures. They're actually sort of tiny. This shows you sort of, two groups that are sort of equal. The Europeans are obviously more sophisticated, more advanced. But, they see the Indians as like real people doing real stuff. And so they're doing deals. They're trading. This is the early period when basically Europeans think Indians operate like they do. Now, of course, this is totally wrong because Indians had, for 7,000 years had absolutely no contact, except very limited contact with any type of European. So they had their view of almost anything was going to be totally different or not related to what the Europeans said. But it's also true that the guys in this side of the picture, the Indians on this side, thought the Europeans act like them. So if this is the Dutch and they're buying Manhattan for, $26 in beads and stuff like that, then from the Indian standpoint, they thought they were doing one type of deal. From the Dutch standpoint, they thought they were doing another type of deal. Neither side understood that they didn't even understand what a deal was. They both looked at it in the context of what they were comfortable and familiar with. So that was the view of Native Americans. And that was pretty much what was there. Now what happens is two things. One is, of course, this very quickly falls apart because when these groups actually start interacting on a daily basis, they very quickly realize that they do not see the world the same way. And they are very, very different. And not surprisingly, given groups view that they're better, you end up with a fair amount of intolerance and violence very quickly ensues. The second part of this is Europe was going through this tremendous change. And in fact, your best example of this, you ever watch that? There's a bunch of documentaries and stuff on it, but the English Civil War is probably the best example of this. In the late medieval period, what happened is a sort of a major change occurred. Your elites, who we oftentimes think of nobility, so folks with titles, knights, earls, kings, all that type of stuff like that, had originally just been the best warriors or the guys with the best political relationships that controlled a piece of territory. But by the late medieval period, what happens is they start to institutionalize this. So for example, Jared in the 1300s would be the Duke of something because he'd basically beaten the crap out of everyone and he was the biggest boy on the block. By the 1400s, what would happen is his grandkid would get the job because Jared had beat the other guys. So his grandkid doesn't have to beat people up. His grandkid inherits the title. So what you get in the medieval period in Europe is a change from basically almost like a, martial arts, competition where the best end up at the top. You end up in a situation where basically, as long as you've got the title, you keep the title, and what you do is you spin a new way of argument. Your new argument is God let you win, or God helped you win. So therefore, God says you're better than the people around you. So therefore, what happens in the late medieval period is your European elites, your monarchy, your folks with titles, they start to not see themselves as the same as the rest of the population. This becomes a segregation between the titled elite, the nobility of Europe, and what they called peasants. It's important to remember that this was like a caste system. Peasants couldn't become titled elites by the late medieval period. Titled elites could never become peasants. Someone who had stuff could lose it all and live in a hut like a peasant, but they still had a title. Folks that were successful and were peasants were never going to have a title. They were two entirely different, sort of like almost two societies, like oil and water, that happened to be in the same place. Now, because this is all couched within the concepts and logic of the Catholic Church, within Roman Catholicism, and the church was seen as the validator of that, you start to get this very symbiotic relationship with the Catholic Church and basically Catholicism in general and elites, where elites sponsor the church, and the church validates the fact that the elites are actually there because God put them there. So it's not someone's military skills anymore or their political skills. Now they're there because God has sort of tapped them on the shoulder and said, congratulations, Jared, you're it. And then the church will constantly reinforce this. This is one of the main reasons for things like cathedrals. Cathedrals were built by rulers. Guys in charge would build these big churches. And those big churches were to remind everyone else that I'm in charge. It's sort of got like their name on top of it. It's like Alan Wong's restaurant. It's not a restaurant, it's Alan Wong's restaurant. So the concept of nobility was very much the idea that you were a special, very different type of person. You actually were genealogically different. In other words, going to sociobiology, the titled elites in Europe saw themselves as actually being physiologically and genetically different than the unwashed majority peasant population. Now, in the 1600s, especially the 1600s, Catholicism is going through a lot of changes. You end up with the ugly wars of Reformation, which go on, I don't know, 100 years or something like that. Anyways, basically, all of Europe ends up in this turmoil. And this turmoil is sort of based on, in part, this relationship between nobility, i.e. your elites, and the church. And the fact that it's become so symbiotic is there became a lot of questions as whether Catholicism was actually a religion or Catholicism is sort of like a political support system. You end up with guys like the Holy Roman Emperor, whose job was to protect the Catholic faith. But he just also happened to be the ruler of all of Germany, Austria, and stuff like that. You end up with popes who basically give dispensions for a fair amount of cash. The Pope will give you a piece of paper which basically absolves you of all your sins. And they would do that very frequently for nobility. So if you were a peasant, forget it. You were never going to see that. You're just going to go to hell when you died. So you end up with two different groups. And this is a large part of the Wars of Reformation, is this whole discussion about the relationship between the religious text and the religious part of Christianity, which was tied to morality and ethics, and the political symbiotic relationships that you see in Europe by the late medieval period, where, you know, popes were poisoning each other. You had two popes for a while. You ended up with this very complicated situation. Most of your popes for almost 300 years are from elite Italian families. They would poison the existing pope and they'd put one of their relatives in the position. So there was very little difference between being head of a state and being the pope. And at that point, it got very confusing just exactly what was Catholic. And that's the reason for the Wars of Reformation. The Wars of Reformation were basically, and that's one reason why the one group called themselves the Protestants. They were protesting. They were protesting the fact that the religion had become a political instrument. And this is something the Catholicism and the Catholic Church still do have to deal with today in some areas, especially in, say, Latin America. So anywho's, so we segue and we now move forward, we'll just say arbitrarily 1700. The Indians in the Americas have been discovered. By the early 1500s, they've been enslaved. Most of your Indian population in the eastern seaboard of the United States are turned into slaves to the extent that the populations basically disappear, and they have to start porting Africans from northern Western Africa to replace the killed off Indians. In Mexico, you wipe out 60% of the population in the first 60 years because you enslave the entire population. So what happened is Indians as equivalents very quickly get replaced with Indians as draft animals. In the Spanish Empire, if you were an Indian, you were a draft animal. They counted you the same as a jackrabbit or a donkey or something else. You were not a person. You weren't a person in the Spanish Empire nor in the Catholic view until the 1700s. So if someone gets a deed to property, the property included the Indians, the plants, and the other animals. So all of a sudden they move from being different but similar to you to being seen something much less than human. And this is still a really strong stereotype you get on a lot of the US mainland, especially in areas around reservations, where there's still a very strong sense that Indians are not actually modern human Homo sapiens. There's some sort of not quite their subgroup, that Indians are wild, that Indians can't handle their liquor, that Indians get upset really quick, they have a real short temper, they have all this, they have all that. They can bond with animals, they can do all those classic stereotypes. You still see a lot of even in movies and TV shows about Indians. And that's nothing to do with the Indians, it's everything to do with the European or later Anglo-Americans looking at Indians. So this is all morphing through. And the reason this becomes critical is in the same period of time, of course, you have Europeans complaining about their own groups. Now, an art form at the time, or I don't know, form of entertainment, maybe be a better way to phrase it, was philosophy. Nowadays, it's it is what it is. You guys might have to take a philosophy class. But back in the 1700s, this was actually it was a form of stand-up comedy, almost like. So you'd hire Kobe and Michela, and you guys would actually go and you guys would be hired by the King of France. And he brings you in, okay, we're going to have you, we want to have to stand up, we're going to want to have you guys to have a stand-up debate on Saturday. And so you guys are going to get paid a good chunk of money to show up. The king and all his hangers-on and the whole court are going to hang around. They're going to be, drinking wine and having good food and sitting down. You're supposed to entertain them. And so what you guys have to do is you have to come up with an argument where Kobe takes one side of it and Michelle takes the other side of it, and you guys argue your point of view. And so it's almost like a court case. You guys are like two competing lawyers or something like that. And everyone's paying to be entertained. Now, that's what philosophers did. They were entertainers in the 15th, especially 16, 1700s. And so we'll say that one of you has decided that you want to be sort of edgy, because even today, good comedy is oftentimes edgy comedy, otherwise it's boring. So you guys decide you're going to push the envelope. So we'll say that one of you thinks, okay, well, what I want to do is I really want to PR the king, since he's paying for this gig. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that the French monarchy, the guys sitting in front of me, are actually special unto God. And I'm going to argue that they're better than anyone else like that. And recent history and everything else reflects that. Now, to do that, I have to find a group they can diss on. You don't want to really diss on the French peasants, because those are the guys around the corner. They're also the servants in the palace. So you know, a little bit iffy. You don't know where your next gig is going to be. So you want to find someone to diss that's not actually there. And he suddenly goes, hey, wait a second. I can diss on these guys. So he talks about the European massacres of immigrants, and how the Indians, I should say, the Indian massacre of immigrants. And he comes up with images, or he sees images like this, or people have seen images like this, and these are stories people are talking about. And he says, yeah, you know, Indians, you know, they kill women, they steal kids, they scalp people, they burn down settlements. They're just absolutely these savage monsters. In contrast to the guys who are paying for the gig. So you argue that the French court, and especially the French king, because they're blessed by God, are a reflection of God's intent, which is that these people should be in charge. And see, here's these degraded people on other parts of the planet that aren't even human. So this is basically, you're pumping the French royalty, which is smart because they're paying for the gig. Now the problem is Michelle is sort of a second situation. Because how are you going to argue? What are you going to do? You can't argue. You've got to argue against what he's saying. So what you do is you argue, no. You guys have got this all wrong. What you actually have is the Indians were equally, in fact, more innocent. The Indians they're simpler. They don't have fancy clothes. They don't have fancy ships. They don't have the technology. They're closer to nature than Europeans are. So you argue that basically the Europeans rip off the Indians and the Europeans kill the Indians, which was frequently very true. So in that situation, you say that the Indians are actually better people than the Europeans, because the Europeans, though they had the knowledge, though they visit North America, when North America is done, the Indians are all dead and the Europeans are in charge. Call them Anglo-Americans now. So your point of view is going to be that the Europeans actually aren't better, that the Europeans, because they were Christian, should have known how to act like good Christians, and that doesn't include killing Indians. So your argument's going to be the flip. And of course, remember, you guys are trying to argue opposite points of view because you're trying to make some money. You're trying to entertain your audience. But notice how Michelle has to be really careful, though, because at some point you're also dissing on the guy that pays for the gig. Because at some point, if the Europeans are actually not as good, then the king of the French, who is one of the guys in charge of these guys, is not good. And you have to be very careful, because if he's not totally stupid, he's going to figure that out. Someone's going to go, dude, that's a really lame argument, at which point you find yourself in the Bastille, and all of a sudden the guillotine comes down and your gig's over. And Kobe goes home a lot more money, but he's now got no competition, because competition now in two pieces. So you have to remember, since these folks had complete and total control of everyone underneath them, if you piss these people off, they will kill you on the spot, because they're there by being blessed by God, which means they don't have to follow any rules. This is why the British whacked the head off of Charles I in, I don't know, 1640 or whatever it was, in the English Civil War. The English Civil War was largely about, is the king actually above law? Or is the king held to laws? In other words, is everyone who's human subject to the rule of the Bible? Or can some people be above that and basically make their own? Royalty argued they were above it. Everyone else said, no, I don't think so. And that's one of the major reasons for the religious wars in Europe in the 15, 16, 1700s. Now, initially, then you could spin this argument with the Indians and the Europeans, but the problem that was getting into it by this period of time is 1700, the Europeans have been interacting with the Indians for 200 years, and they pretty much wiped them out. Indians have there are no Indians left, for example, in Rhode Island. The 8 tribes that used to exist there were genocided out by largely the Brits. by 1700. So whole parts of what's now North America and the United States, there was no one left there who was an Indian. So it was really hard to make those arguments because there are already so many stereotypes about brutal Indians or stupid Indians that it wasn't a compelling argument anymore. But everyone still had the stereotype of what we call the savage. You either have the savage who is the savage that kills everyone, or you have the idea of the noble savage. So there's the brutal animal, or there's the thing that can stand still and a bird flies on their hand and stuff like that. That was that stupid Disney movie Pocahontas. Okay. So that's the two ways that you look at that, and it's still part and parcel of the American stereotypes of Indians. But of course, by 1700s, that becomes, you know, it's become almost a historical discussion, though it still persists. This is why you have the Native American schools, the Indian schools of the 1800s, which is where my Indian side of the family got out of the Midwest to get out of the Indian schools. Because at the age of 6 or 7, you were forcibly taken from your parents and put in a boarding school, and you didn't get any visit from your relatives for 4 years. So from age 7 to age 15, you were in basically a prison where you were domesticated and taught how to be a person, because otherwise you were going to be a wild Indian and you were never going to be civilized. You were going to be a savage. So that's that one spin. That was what we call Voltaire's point of view of the other, which is the fact that the Europeans are better and everyone else was a lame failure. Let's see, let me do this again now. Can we go back to here? Oops. Now, when the Europeans discover the Pacific, this is a lot later. The Europeans, for all intents and purposes, discover the Pacific in the 1700s. They're actually there in small numbers prior to that, but they don't really make any sense of it. It's largely not till the 1750s, 1770s that the Europeans really start to come up with what they've decided the Pacific is. And in that context, they end up with a bunch of stuff. And one of the strangest is basically the fact that for some reason, and I've never seen a good account of this, everyone sort of agrees on it. And of course, at the time, they just thought it was the way the world should be. But they came up with this rather strange idea that the folks in the Eastern Pacific, i.e. Polynesians, actually were a form of European. Europeans by the 1700s were really big on the Old Testament. And one part, something in the Old Testament, I have to check with one of the religion folks, was in what was the old state of Judea or Israel. Something happens to one of the tribes. They piss off, like it's Romans or the Assyrians. Anyways, they piss off someone, and these guys come in and basically stomp the crap out of the Israelites. And in that process, one of the tribes disappears. And the general assumption was they had migrated out. Now, for some reason, I'm not sure what the logic of this was. The Europeans that bump into the people in the Eastern Pacific, i.e. Polynesians, in the 1700s, come up with the idea that folks like this, that Polynesians are actually the descendants of the lost tribe of Israel. And this was commonly accepted by the mid-1700s. So if you're from the rest of the Pacific, you're from Micronesia or you're from Melanesia and the rest of the Pacific, they were seen as aliens. So they were seen as related to Native Americans or Africans or something like that. There was some not as good form of the human species. But if you're Polynesian, they actually saw you as a very innocent, naive, sort of like a bunch of kids brought up in a closet version of Europeans who just happened to have a really good tan and had black hair. So right from the get-go, they saw themselves in their relationship with Polynesians as being as naive, innocent, beautiful children. They did not see them as savages per se. So what doesn't happen, weirdly enough, is this whole sort of collapse of that view into sort of what happens with Native Americans. It might start out that way. Very quickly, they turn into savages. That never happens with Polynesians. And a classic case, of course, would be here. Okay, you get the Europeans, i.e. Cook, show up. Cook shows up in Hawaii, eventually runs afoul of the high chief in the Big Island by virtue of doing some stupid shit. And he gets his ass kicked. The most famous explorer in the Pacific gets shot down at Kealakekua Bay. Now, if this had happened elsewhere, for example, if it happened that it did happen in Melanesia, then it shows how savage the Melanesians are. If it happened in North America, then it shows how savage the Indians are. If it happened in Africa, it shows you how savage the Zulus or someone else are. When it happens in Hawaii, because Hawaii is part of Polynesia, everyone blames Cook. So if you're European and you get whacked by Polynesians, you must have done something wrong, because Polynesians are these innocent children who are actually our relatives if you're European. So they get cut a whole amount of slack. Okay. That's not true of anyone else in the Pacific, nor anyone else outside of the Pacific. Okay. And even down till today, right from the get-go, when Cook's killed and everyone's shocked, but almost within a couple of months, what they start asking is like, wow, like how the hell did he, how did he piss him off so bad? How did he screw it up so bad? That's not a discussion you hear anyone else. In fact, if you think about it, you never hear the word Cook and his, because remember, a bunch of his crew gets whacked too. You never hear the word massacre. What you cook is Cook gets killed. But you don't talk about a massacre of a famous British explorer and his crew at the shores of Kealakekua Bay. And they end up with tons of images, that show Cook getting bumped off. I can't find any of them right here. Oh, here we go. Here's just before he gets whacked. Okay. Largely because he tries to kidnap the high chief, which is incredibly stupid. That's hard to figure out what he was thinking. But anyways, so he pays for it. So he ends up dead. His body gets dismembered. Parts of it get ritually consumed by the Ku priest of that part of the Big Island. And then eventually they give parts of the body back to the Brits. Now, interesting thing about this, the Brits come back and they ask for parts of the body. In the rest of the world, the Brits would have come in with an army, beat the shit out of the Hawaiians, and taken everything and burned everything down. They would have, quote, taught them a lesson. In this case, even the British Navy's convinced Cook must have screwed up. Okay, so this becomes a huge part of how Europeans see Polynesians. Right from the get-go, Europeans don't see Polynesians as being different. They see Polynesians as basically being innocent, naive, childlike versions of themselves. And so therefore they have, on one hand, that seems like a positive. Let's find another one of these images. And so when you see these images, the Polynesians are portrayed in a very positive light, but notice how it's a very romanticized light. It's not the reality of Tahitian or Samoan or Hawaiian society in, say, 1778. It's the European ethos, because in that view of the tribe of Israel's kids, there's a very strong attitude that because that tribe ended up in the Eastern Polynesian region, that somehow they had escaped civilization. So they were closer to the Garden of Eden, if you would. Polynesians were seen as the closest relatives to Adam and Eve. So they reflected a childlike innocence that the Europeans had lost. And that's still a huge part of the tourism industry in 2020. To a certain extent, the way that Polynesians now even self-image is based on this idea that they're seen as innocent positives. And you can much more question the value or the integrity of European values with the Polynesians being alternative. There's not a discussion you can have in the rest of the Pacific. So the whole set of bias is very much a very complicated one that has to do with the issue of the way that the Europeans saw folks in this part of the world.
Good morning.
Good morning. So Polynesia then, of course, also gets spun off. If these folks are this lost tribe, if they're actually Europeans who end up in the Pacific, then because of the tropical environment of the nature, and you have to remember the first place these folks hang out around is basically the Tuamotus, Marquesas, and Tahiti, basically the society group, largely Tahiti. So a lot of the stuff gets written by the British and French and Dutch explorers in the eastern part of Polynesia, to a lesser extent Cooks and Australs. In that, from their standpoint, and again, you can still see this. Let's quickly switch out of here. Do this. What they very quickly decide is that, wow, these places are basically paradise. Bora Bora is probably one of the classic examples of this. These places become the paradise or Eden that the Europeans lost because Adam and Eve ate the apple or whatever the hell it was they did. And somehow Polynesians, by virtue of being refugees from this period of time, went almost back to that paradise. And so what happens is Polynesia gets seen as paradise. And the folks in Polynesia, i.e. the Polynesians, become the children of God who stayed closest to what God intended in the Garden of Eden. Okay. Now that means that the Europeans have been a very sort of paradoxical relationship with these folks. Now remember, we're not talking about anything to do with the folks that are actually from Polynesia. This is all to do with the Europeans looking at them. So this is from the outsider looking at it. It's like someone standing outside an aquarium looking in the aquarium. You're not asking the fish what they think. You're labeling the fish. So in that context, the Europeans are very ambivalent about who they are, i.e. themselves. Because if these folks are actually closer to God's intent, if they live in paradise, then the Europeans got to ask themselves, what right do we have to mess this up? Okay. And this is a discussion that you constantly get with Polynesians, even into today, though oftentimes now it'll be contexted maybe in an environmental situation. But the idea that Polynesia is paradise, so here's a classic one. The idea that Polynesia is paradise is a huge part of the whole discussion. It's still an enormous part. This drives 95% of the tourism to the Hawaiian Islands. It drives all the tourism to places like Tahiti. People don't go to Tahiti to experience Tahitian society. They go to experience their views of paradise or paradise lost or Eden that's almost not there anymore. And so if you're smart and you want to market yourself, and you're a society islander, like folks from Bora Bora, you dress up in the outfits that really have not a lot to do with traditional logic, since these were ritual outfits that were used in only particular ceremonies. You now do these at tourist shows because you want the tourists to see that you're sophisticated, you're exotic, and you're different, and you're the children of Eden. You're the children of paradise. So bias and perceptions of the other drive everything here from the minute the Europeans arrive. So from that moment on, they see Hawaiians in this context. Now, one of the weird side effects of this, come on, babies, wake up, there we go, is that when Europeans are looking at, especially here in Hawaii, but in Polynesia in general, one of the things they have to figure out is how the hell did the Israelites get from Israel, basically West Asia, to Polynesia? Why didn't they stop and around? Why didn't they end up somewhere else? So what happens very quickly then is the European fascination with Polynesians really is not very much to do with who the Polynesians are. It has a lot more to do with where they came from. And this is actually the original marching orders for Bishop Museum. All the original work that Bishop Museum did right into the 1930s and 40s had to do with the basis of Polynesian societies, but their main logic was, where did Polynesian come from? The idea of the migration of Polynesians. Now, there's almost no discussion right into the 1980s about where Melanesians or Micronesians came from. All anyone interested is where the Polynesians came from. Why? Because the Polynesians were the only ones that were important in the Euro-American ethos, because the Polynesians were, quote, real people. They were not savages. Okay. Now, this becomes a real complicated thing if you actually have to deal with real Tahitians or real Hawaiians who are from a very different cultural ethos then. The Europeans are going to look at them very differently than they're going to look at some other groups. On one hand, they might cut them some slack. Oh, you can't judge them too much because they're different than us. On the other hand, you're going to have very high expectations and they should act in this way or that way because that's what it says in the Bible people are supposed to be like, and these guys are supposed to be closer to the Bible precepts than the European Americans are. Now, you guys see this in 2020, if and when tourism ever starts up again. This is the whole thing, if you remember before tourism crapped out, this is the whole idea of the aloha spirit, the aloha way, that everyone here has to be friendly and nice, because that's part of the Euro-American stereotype of Polynesia. Is it true? No. Traditionally in Polynesia, you were nice to particular people. Other people were perfectly comfortable killing on the spot. The Polynesians didn't kill Cook by accident. They killed him intentionally. And it makes perfect sense from the context of Hawaiian society to whack that guy. So, but that's not the way that you package it from the European stereotypes. And this is where Moana or what was the other movie? Lilo and Stitch, from way before you guys were born. You can stereotype Polynesians in a very positive way, but that doesn't mean you're going to spend any time really learning anything about the society, about the culture, about the groups. Okay. So second B, let's see, let's get rid of this. Okay. The geography class covers this in a lot more depth, so just go through this really quick. When you're looking at this, here's the Hawaiian Islands right in the middle. We are the most isolated piece of decent sized real estate on the planet. There are other islands which are more isolated, but they're not large. They're not significant in size. We are part of an island chain that goes all the way up here and basically covers a huge amount of territory. The Hawaiian Islands, when you add them together, are larger than a large part of all of the rest of Polynesia rolled together. The only one that really outsizes us hugely would be Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, what makes this really different is the rest of Polynesia is all the way down here. So if you're looking at Samoa, if you're looking at Tonga, if you're looking at the societies, Tuamotus, Marquesas, all those guys over here, you're way the hell different from here. There's nothing within roughly 2,000 miles of us. If you sail from if Tara or someone else sails down from Honolulu Harbor, you take your boat and you're going to go sail down here, you better not be on a stand-up paddleboard because it's going to be 2,200 miles before you hit land. Even on a fast ship, it's going to take you, let's see, normal is 18 to 25 days to get from Hawaii to Tahiti. And that's moving 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you're trying to get to the West Coast, that normal route is about 21 days. They have a Transpac race, which a friend of mine used to go in. And the fast boats can make it maybe in 8 or 10 days, but a lot of those boats break and oftentimes they sink trying to get here faster. So the normal was basically figure 3 weeks to get to here, 3 weeks to get to here. And of course, this way, forget it. That's 5,000 miles to the west. So we're the most isolated piece of large landmass in the entire planet. So there's that factor. Secondly, if you've noticed right now, we still have, hopefully better have trade since I walked to work this morning. What happens is our normal wind system actually occurs up here. So about 300 days of the year, if it's a normal year, what happens if you get winds blowing this way, and they come down off of this area here, basically off the Alaska region, and they come roaring down this way and they blow this way. Now you have to remember, till 100 years ago, the only way people got around was under sail. You had to sail places. Now what happens if Malia's down here and she's in Samoa and she wants to sail up to Hawaii then? What can't you do in a sailboat?
Go against the wind?
Yeah, you can't go against the wind, man. You're just flat out of luck. You're going to go backwards. I've got a 36-foot boat. If I tried to take it out of Keiki Lagoon and the wind's blowing in my face, I'm going to be on the ground. You do not have any luck at all. And especially traditional Polynesian sailing canoes. They've got what we call a crab claw sail. Those suckers are really efficient airfoils. But within about 30 degrees of the wind, you're screwed. It's basically like putting on a parking brake. And you're going to start going backwards. So you can't, for roughly 11 months of the year, you can't get from here to here unless you plan on paddling. And if any of you have ever paddled, you can imagine paddling a 60-foot canoe with basically 80 people on board, all the food and water and everything. You try to paddle that sucker from there to here, you're going to have some really good looking upper body development by the time you get there. But of course, you will have died by the time you probably get 1/3 of the way. Just can't do it. Okay. So one of the problems you get into is not only are we just physically isolated just by virtue of actual distance, but the wind systems actually work against where the rest of the population was, which was all down here. If you're trying to go this way, your folks in the North American region were land-based. They had canoes. You get these really nice dugout canoes in the Pacific Northwest, but those suckers are sort of like a stand-up paddleboard with sides on it. There ain't no way in God's green earth anyone would be stupid enough to go from there to try to get down to here. You're gonna die. You're gonna die. It's not by accident that the Hokulea and other Polynesian voyage canoes in the 21st century go up here to visit, but you don't see canoes from the Pacific Northwest coming to go check us out. Even with modern sat nav and all the rest of it, it's just that's nuts, and it doesn't make any sense. So you're not going to get to here because, one, they don't have the interest. Two, they don't really have the technology. You've got the technology down here, but given the amount of effort, you're not really going to have the interest. Now, the third thing is when you look at this part of the world, the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest single physical feature on the planet, we're by far the largest body of water on the entire planet. It's a good chunk. I never know what the percentage is, but it's a good chunk of the world's water is in this particular piece of real estate. And it basically splits along the equator into two parts. The part in the north, which is north of all our relatives, you have to remember that the rest of Polynesia is in the South Pacific. So again, if Malia is trying to start, I can't remember who I was picking on before. If Malia or someone's trying to sail from here up this way, she has to go through a dead zone because the winds down here go one direction. The winds up here go in the opposite direction. So there's roughly a 20-degree or almost a week if you're sailing from here down south. And it's the problem with the Hokulea and the other canoes go down to visit Tahiti or something like that. You get down to right about here and there's no wind. Because what happens is in the northern hemisphere, the winds circulate this way. The winds blow this way, I should say, and the currents circulate this way. It's sort of like a giant toilet bowl if you want to think of it that way. In the southern Pacific, the winds come this way and the water circulates this way. So in the middle here, it don't do nothing. You got no winds and the water ain't doing nothing. They called this I can't remember what the old technical term was, but sailors used to hate it because you could be stuck in here and you could die here. If you got stuck in a sailing boat and you had no other way to go, you could die of starvation and thirst. The Spanish were famous for doing this. They'd try to get over here and they'd end up in here and you just see, somewhere it's like Pirates of the Caribbean, you end up with a dead boat. So what you end up is this part of the world is very isolated from this part of the world, again, by another physical feature, which is the currents. This is usually called the Kuroshio current. You guys probably most famously know this because one of the side effects is because it spins this way, it ends up with a subspin up here, which is that great Pacific gyre that everyone's all excited about, where all the crap is floating around up here that ends up on our beaches. That's because of the sub effect of the circulation. So you can have the most famous example was back in the 1990s, some containers fell off of a container ship, I think off of here somewhere. They had Nike sneakers or something in them. And they actually were able to map them and they were able to show up when the Nike sneakers showed up, on Hawaiian shore. Of course, when they had the great Fukushima earthquake, the stuff ended up here about a year later. That's because of this current system moving things around here. So a little boat from Fukushima, maybe in, 10 years ago, the earthquake knocks it offshore and it's floating here. It's going to go like this. It's going to go all the way down here, go all the way down to the equator pretty much, circle around here, and eventually in a decreasing spiral, again, like water going down a toilet. It's going to end up here. It doesn't go here. It goes here. Now, what that means is plants and animals from Asia and the Americas don't go here. They would have to survive this circular pattern. This is why you don't see things like chipmunks and squirrels and all sorts of stuff that you see in the Americas, or rhinoceroses and other stuff they used to have in Asia. You don't see it here in this part of the Pacific because the buggers couldn't make the trip because it wasn't a straight run. It was a circular run. Now, what that means is not only are we physically isolated distance-wise, wind-wise, but the currents basically put up this third layer of fences. Now, one of the side effects, if you've watched that video, is this means the Hawaiian Islands, anything that makes it here is basically sort of like won a lottery. I think the normal estimate is, I think they just changed it a couple of years ago, but the normal estimate is 1 in every 50,000 years, something would arrive here. So we'll say that some type of a bee arrives here in the Hawaiian Islands. But the problem is if that's a male bee, what's going to happen in a year or two? I think bees have a 2-year lifespan. What's going to happen in 2 years if that bee lands on the island of Oahu?
Isn't it going to end up propagating?
What's missing in that? Your argument would be right except for one thing. What does that male bee need?
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, you need a female bee or else you got immaculate conception, which I don't think they have in bees, but I don't know, you have to check with the religion department. So yes, I mean, the problem is you've got to have, the one thing you want to have is you really would want pregnant females of a species to arrive here. And if you think about that, that's such an iffy proposition. Or you have to have a male and female arrive at the same point in time. Because most animals have very short lifespans. Even plants have very short lifespans. So when you start to realize that everything you see here in the Hawaiian Islands, at the time of Polynesian arrival, is a result of, 2 million years of Las Vegas type random chance. You end up with, on one hand, a very, very different, very exotic in many ways ecosystem here, where the plants and the animals that are here when the Polynesians arrived 1,500 years ago are the result of these accidental migrations. But
how did the early voyagers get there if the wind was working against them?
This is what you do if you're the Hokulea. If you're the Hokulea, you don't come up here any time of year. What you do is you wait, because if you remember in about, let's see, we'll say September now. Anyone know what's going to happen roughly in November or December? What happens to
Winds change direction.
Yeah, the winds change direction. That's our ugly Kona season. That's when you really got to worry about hurricanes, for example, or cyclones. Because what happens is these systems shut down for about 3 months. So for about 3 months, you don't have that persistent trades, and the winds will come from almost anywhere. Oftentimes we call them Kona winds, and they're coming out of the southwest. Which means if you got cyclones starting up here, normally that's why if you watch the reports of cyclones, they start in Mexico and they go this way because the winds are pushing them south all the time. If those winds shut down, then it's hello, and they'll come up here, which is where they want to go, and they just whack our ass. So the situation is, for a short period of time, you have Kona winds, but you never know exactly when they're going to start. So that means if you're down here, we'll say 2,000 years ago, and you think there might be something up here, you're not sure, but you think there might be. You sort of got to have your boat ready, your crews ready, and when the winds suddenly crap out, because Kona starts here at the same time, the wind shut down on the entire Pacific at the same time, then you're going to get that boat and try to get up here. But it's tricky because you need the regular trades to get to the equator, but then you need the trades to have crapped out to get from there to here. So you really got to have your shit together. And it's one of the main things to remember is Polynesians were absolutely superb sailors and superb navigators. They understood everything about the world they lived in, which was the Pacific Ocean. And even down till recently, I was trained in a little bit of this. When you're out on the water, you don't look at maps. You taste the water. You can actually feel the water. I don't know how to describe it, but if you're used to it, you can actually go out on the ocean. You can be in a spot and you can actually feel the way the water feels, and you actually put your hand on the top of it. And you can sense change. If you're used to it, you can sense changes in the way that water is functioning. Oftentimes those changes are like a barometer. Those changes will actually tell you what's going to happen maybe 10 or 12 hours in the future. So the folks that were navigating these ships down here, over centuries of observation, realized the wind shift patterns and basically read their, sort of walked their way up here by virtue of reading the conditions. And that's how Polynesians settled Hawaii. They settled Hawaii because of the superb knowledge and skill about reading the ocean. But they didn't read the ocean the way that we read it in the 21st century. My boat, for example, has GPS. It has a sat nav system. It has a mapping system. It has a depth finder and all that stuff. In the Polynesian system, it was like you guys walking down a road. You walk down a road, you see what's in front of you, you look around you, and you sense all that stuff together, and that's the package you use. So the Polynesians basically sort of walked their way up here by virtue of their enormous amount of knowledge on how the ocean operated. They didn't know Hawaii was there. They just knew how the ocean operated. So when they discover the Hawaiian Islands and arrive, they managed to breach this isolation because of their skill set. But what that also means is even then, it was like, if we really wanted to, next year, we could send people to land on Mars. We don't have the money or the interest, but we could do it. Technologically, it's possible. So what you need is you need to have the resource and the investment and the interest to make it happen. It's always important to remember, if you're down here, because our canoes came from the Marquesas, it's pretty clear. Hawaiian's most closely related language-wise to the Marquesas. Genetically, we're the closest relationship. Everything, the closest relationship is to Marquesas. And they were some of the best sailors in this part of the Pacific, not the least of reasons being, if you're familiar with the Marquesas, they're pretty much in the middle. You've got to be able to sail because they're pretty much in the middle of nothing. So they knew how to get around. And they're the ones that, for whatever set of reasons, decided to come up here and check us out. In that process, that was an enormous investment. 70 to 90 foot sailing crew in the Marquesas would have taken the entire resources of a whole chunk of the islands just to make that ship, put the people on it, put the food and resources on it, and send it up here. So they must have been incredibly motivated to come up here and try to settle in the Hawaiian Islands, and undoubtedly knew about the islands before they settled in them. You don't go and send a bunch of people off to settle something you don't know exists. But what that then meant is when they send them up here, they just couldn't come up here. It wasn't like you guys jumping in a car and driving out to Waipahu. It'd be a whole different thing to think about it. If all of a sudden Julian decided he wasn't going to go out to Waipahu, but he had to walk there from Chaminade, you're going to think about that a little bit. That's a long hike. That's about, I don't know, maybe 17 miles, something like that. If there's nothing in between, if it's desert, you'd have to carry enough food and water to get to Waipahu and get back. So you're not going to go there because you just want to talk story with someone. You're going to have a real serious reason. So the major thing to remember is Hawaii, when it was settled or discovered and settled by Polynesians, was that the Polynesians knew that Hawaii existed by the time they settled it. But that didn't mean that there was a lot of interaction taking place because it was too expensive. It was way too much in the way of resources to go and deal with some group that had nothing. And once you've got the resources up here, sailing back down here is the same problem. It's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly expensive. Now people did it. There's all sorts of accounts of people coming from there up to here, as we'll see later, especially Pa'ao and this group coming up from Tahiti to here. There's all sorts of accounts of folks from Hawaii sailing back down to the societies groups, and then in some cases coming back up again. But that'd be sort of the equivalent of someone climbing Mount Everest and going and doing it twice. Just because someone did it just doesn't mean that everyone else does it all the time. So even though Hawaii becomes part of Polynesia, it's not part of this area where people literally did jump in a canoe and go from place to place on a weekly basis. It was very much a part that they were a part of the system in many ways, but very quickly they become isolated enough that they're doing their own thing. So it's important to remember that Hawaiians are Polynesians who end up in Hawaii, but once they're in Hawaii, a lot of what happens there is then unique to the Hawaiian Islands because of the relative isolation from the other folks. Now you see exactly the same thing with, of course, the other big settlement from Polynesia, and that's the Polynesians sail down and settle in Aotearoa, i.e. New Zealand. When the folks from the Marquesas and Cooks sail down and settle here in Aotearoa, very quickly they got the same problem. Getting across here is one of the most dangerous pieces of water on the planet. It's almost impossible, even today, to take a small sailing ship from Auckland in New Zealand and sail to someplace like Tahiti. You really got to have your shit together, and they lose ships every year. So this is incredibly dangerous. So what it means is the folks here that end up settling as Polynesians in Aotearoa, they are part of this, but very quickly they end up doing their own thing because they really don't have a lot of contact. It's too risky, it's too expensive, it's too costly, and so it just doesn't happen. So this is one reason why Polynesians and Maori don't do a lot of stuff that you see in Central Polynesia. They tend to very much go on their own ways. They come from a common source, but very quickly you could argue that they come from a common culture, but over time what happens is cultures then sort of fragment and follow their own paths of change that are different than what you see in Central Polynesia, which, you know, goes through its own changes. So Tahitian society right now does not look a lot like the Samoan society, for example. So if you went back 500 years ago, it'd be very hard to see a lot of difference. So you know, all these areas are changing. It's one of the definitions of culture is it's dynamic. So Hawaiian society is largely driven by this relative isolation. The Polynesians conquer it, I guess maybe be a word for it. But nonetheless, they're still constrained by the cost and the effort that's involved. Now, one of the side effects of this is if you're Polynesian and you arrive, one of the areas they would have arrived in, simply because if you can get here, sailing around the islands isn't that difficult. You just got to have your shit together. And obviously, if they had their shit together, they wouldn't have got here in the first place. One of your most logical places of arrival to set up shop is here on Oahu in Kaneohe Bay. We see some of the earliest dates for archaeological sites in this particular area, and that's not by accident, it makes sense. Because when the Polynesians arrived here, they found themselves in a huge, stunning shock. Let me switch this share here. Let me do that next time. Okay. And the reason for that was very simple. They're coming up from Central Polynesia. So if we go back to our other share. Wish I could do two shares at the same time on this. So we segue back. They're coming up from Central Polynesia. So you remember they're coming from what oftentimes now called the South Seas. So they're coming from Central Polynesia. The folks in Polynesia originally had migrated from East Asia. They came in from Fujian province, Hainan Island, there's areas there, and along with Indonesia. They move across from basically Southeast Asia, across the Pacific, and end up in Polynesia. That's what we call Malayo-Polynesians. Now, in that process, what that means is that 20, 30,000 year period, however long that took, you're moving from tropical Southeast Asia, or even tropical China, tropical Southeast Asia across the tropical Pacific, and you end up in the small islands in Polynesia. But what hasn't changed is it's all tropical. Now, I don't know, I know we've got a couple of folks from other parts of Polynesia in this class. But you know, if you're from Samoa or you're from Papeete or someplace like that, you do not have the same climate as Hawaii. Those are from the tropical Polynesian region. So there's a lot less temperature variation, and you have a lot more consistent temperatures for the entire year. There's higher humidity in most cases, and so the entire climate's different. The Hawaiian Islands are all subtropical. Now, you guys don't know this right now, but if you flash back to ancient history, like say January or February, I can't remember exactly when, earlier in the year, it was really cold for a couple of weeks. And all the Chaminade students, all you guys were bundled up in hoodies, and you know, you looked like a bunch of, there were people walking around those, whatever those little slipper shoes are with those fur in them and stuff like that. I mean, you guys looked like a bunch of refugees from Anchorage, Alaska. You know, and it was still like 78 degrees out, but you guys thought you're gonna like freeze to death and have frostbite in the middle of campus. And that was like 10 in the morning. So that's going to happen in a subtropical environment. We have seasons. Now you have to remember what that means is the Polynesians arriving here from the Marquesas, they land in the Hawaiian Islands and start checking this place out, and they find out two things. One is these huge islands, because you know the whole Marquesas chain would basically take it maybe this part. In fact, you could probably fit all the Marquesas in Honolulu and have a bunch of spare space. So the Hawaiian Islands are absolutely huge compared to where these folks were coming from. So they must have been absolutely stoked. They saw this fun and go, damn, look at this, we got all this real estate. But on the other hand, they start to walk around, they realize, dude, there's nothing from home here. There were no coconuts. The niu was brought here by Polynesians. Breadfruit, Polynesians. The hala or pandanus, Polynesians. So when they arrived here, they would have seen trees and plants and all sorts of other stuff, but very quickly they would have looked around and realized they didn't recognize much of anything. Even more creepy is when they looked at the plants, there was nothing edible. The endemic Hawaiian environment, the only thing that's really edible is two things. One is the staghorn fern, which is the ferns you see on the slopes. You can eat the roots, but you have to be careful. Second is the thimbleberry, which sort of looks like a little raspberry, which you can still find in the hills if the pigs hadn't eaten it. That's the only two things in the Hawaiian Islands that are edible. So they would have looked at these hillsides, which would have been covered in trees, and they're all green and it looks really lush, until you start to walk around and think, oh, wow. I can't use any of this stuff. So it was almost like it would be like going to a garden and suddenly realizing it's all plastic plants or soap flowers. It looks really good, but when you think, how am I going to harvest it? You suddenly realize there ain't a lot there for you to use. Okay. So in that context, what happened is the Polynesians start to probably panic. The other thing they would have very quickly realized is if you're from Central Polynesia, remember that image I showed you of Bora Bora. All of Polynesia has huge fringing reefs, and that's actually where you get most of your food. In most of Polynesia, you get your food from the reefs. You get your shellfish from the reefs, you get your limu, your seaweed from the reefs, you catch your fish on the inside of the reefs. The reefs are what feeds you. The ocean on the Makai or inland, or I should say the Malka side of the reef break, is actually where most of your food traditionally is. So they come here and they sail to the Hawaiian Islands. And they're looking, for example, at Oahu. And so they're sailing along the coast, and they're looking, and the first thing they're going to be thinking, where the hell did the reef go? We have almost no reef in the Hawaiian Islands. There's a little bit of a pitiful one here. The best one was actually where Sand Island is now. And of course, this side of this island, of the island, up here, Kaneohe side is the only decent reef on the Hawaiian Island. If you go up here further north, you got squat. It's not by accident that surfers love Waimea Bay. Why? Because there ain't no reef there. There's a little breaking fringe, but there's no reef, not by Polynesian standards. And that's where they got their food from. So the minute they would have walked around here and they're going, damn, there's nothing to eat. And they would have walked around here and thought, okay, we're going to go get food from the reef. There's not a lot there. And on top of that, most of the animals and plants that you find in Pacific Island reefs in central Polynesia didn't make it up here either because the water is about 3 degrees cooler. And those suckers are really picky. So they would have got up here and they must have thought they'd been scammed. They would have got up here, they would have had all these pictures of this beautiful, huge paradise and all this, huge amount of real estate, and everyone could just spread out and have a good old time. And very quickly they realize there's no food, there's lots of water. There's almost nothing to eat. So when the Polynesians arrive, one of the first things they do is they change this place. They bring the plants and animals that they brought with them on the canoes and they plant them. And they very quickly try to turn, for example, someplace like Kahalu or someplace like that into a copy of what they would have had on Bora Bora or Mo'area or some other island in the Eastern Polynesian group. They then let the animals go because they were very smart. Going back to our thing about bees, they brought intentionally on Polynesian canoes, you always take a pregnant pig and you make sure that she stays alive. If necessary, you will kill crew members so that they don't use the resources, but you keep the pig alive. Because if she can come here and bear kids, then you've got the next generation of pigs. In the same way you bring one rooster and a couple of chickens, or more accurately, jungle fowl used to be called. Why? Because they'll breed and you'll have new ones. So Polynesians were very used to islands that didn't have a lot. They'd worked up a system over thousands of years of basically settling crapped up pieces of real estate. So when they come here, the first thing they do is they do what they were used to doing. They take everything off the boat and they build a little baby version of Polynesia, probably somewhere right in here. Now, there were a lot of birds here in the Hawaiian Islands. They were largely flightless. They were flightless rails and other birds like that, since they had never seen humans. And there are no predators. The only predator we had on the island of Oahu was this really cool, sort of large version of a nene, which was carnivorous, which I think we should use as Chaminade's mascot instead of a silver sword, but that's my opinion.
I'm sorry, did you say a giant murder bird?
It was well, you know what a nene is, right? The goose, the duck. This was a larger version of it looked like a nene a little bit. We still have skeletons of them, but they were carnivorous. So they hunted smaller birds. We have skeletons from them over here in the Ewa Plain region of the island of Oahu. And we're pretty sure they were in all ends. They were the only predator, which is really cool. So they were our only, interesting thing. So someone's asking, how did they come from if they came from the south end of Kaneohe? They probably ended here just by virtue of choice. What happened is they were moving up because they didn't find any reefs. They kept on going until they found a place that looked a little bit like home, where they thought they had the best chance to survive and set up shop. So that's why Kaneohe would have been a good bet. Kaneohe is about as close to you get to what central Polynesia looks like. Now, of course, they probably arrived here in early summer. So they would have been whacking the local birds, which you literally could walk around and pick the eggs off the ground. The birds didn't nest. They just literally laid their eggs in the ground. You still see this with the shearwaters and stuff. So the birds, there were tons of birds in the Hawaiian Islands. But pretty quickly, the Polynesians that arrive here have to both eat the birds and eat the eggs because there's nothing else to eat. So very quickly, they start to hammer the environment here. And very quickly, numbers of different bird species become extinct upon Polynesian arrival. Again, we have, I think it's 16 species of birds just from this area that become extinct very quickly from Polynesian arrival. They can't handle the Polynesians. The Polynesians bring the Polynesian dog, the pig, all these predate on birds and bird eggs. So what happens is the package of stuff that the Polynesians brought to Hawaii to survive actually pretty much hammered large parts of the endemic ecosystem. So it's important to remember that when the Polynesians arrive, their interest is in survival. They're not interested in, they're environmentally aware, but it's environmentally aware to feed yourself. It's not environmentally aware like, oh, I'm going to starve to death so I don't get rid of this species. You can say, screw that species, I need to eat. So they massively changed the Hawaiian Islands. Among other things, what they do in the areas like here is to basically plant, is you have to do that by clearing the vegetation. So you burn off all the low sections here and you plant the plants that you bring up from Polynesia. You replace the endemic vegetation with your introduced Polynesian vegetation. So for example, among other things, you start scattering coconuts everywhere you can because they're a water source and they're a food source. You start scattering a challah of seeds everywhere you can, so the challah will start to grow. You start scattering all this stuff that you can basically turn this part of this island into a small version of Bora Bora or Mo'area. And in doing so, of course, you make enormous irrevocable changes to the actual ecosystem that had been the Hawaiian ecosystem prior to human arrival. So it's important to remember that when the Polynesians arrive here, they make massive environmental change. It's not because they're unaware of it. They just, survival is what it is. You got to do what you got to do. But it's important to remember that, because one of the European stereotypes of Polynesians, of course, if we go back to those images, is that Polynesians lived in Eden. And one of the things about Eden is no one has to work. All the food's provided by God. That's one of the definitions of Eden. And so when the Europeans arrive and they see folks like the Hawaiians, that's certainly true in the rest of Polynesia. If the Polynesians arrive and they land and they go through someplace like Kaneohe in 1778 or 1800, they don't realize that the landscape they look at has been modified by Polynesians over 1,500 years and turned into something that's very beautiful, very sophisticated agricultural system to feed tens of thousands of people. They see it as God has blessed this place, and the food is just, it's just there. It's God provides. So they're not going to credit the Polynesians with working. They're not going to credit the Polynesians with effort. They're going to say that the Polynesians are really lucky. They're like people that won a lottery. Now that means that you can then devalue the Polynesians. You can say that if Polynesians are farmers or if Hawaiians are farmers, they're just taking advantage of the environment. You don't give them credit for the sophisticated way that they had to manipulate a place that by their standards was really unfriendly. Because Hawaii was a really crappy place to grow Pacific Island crops. And we'll get into that next time, because I've gone on too long on this one. So we'll stop there with the Polynesians having to turn Hawaii into what it is. In that process, they have to change because the environment's only going to go so far. A lot of the changes are changes that you have to make, because you can't turn something into something it ain't going to be. But it's important to remember that we're subtropical. This is very complicated, because if you look at the way we even market ourselves in the 21st century, we talk about the words Eden, we talk about paradise, we talk about the wonders of Polynesia. And yeah, the folks that are here originally were from Polynesia, but Hawaii, in terms of its environment, isn't part of Polynesia. It's subtropical, which is a whole different game. As we'll see, that's what the Polynesians had to deal with, and that'll be next time. So does that sound relevant or useful or whatever?
Yes.
I feel so sorry. It's actually harder watching you guys on a Zoom feed, because if it's in class, and you guys can I can look at a couple of people and everyone else can zone out and be on their phones while they're in their lap or something like that, and everyone looks like they're sort of engaged. Now, of course, most folks are smart and they got their cameras off, so all I see is a black square with a muted mic. So, okay, so for all good, are there any questions? Oh, before I forget, I will get the.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to be starting to read the book, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Read Tengen's first. Read Tengen's Native Men. The other two would be further down the road. Let's start with his. Yeah. You might also start with the Thrum stuff, since that's a quick, easy read and it's easy to get to, since it's all digital.
Awesome.
Okay. Before I forget, I will be trying to finish up. I got it partially done. I told the intro class I was going to have it done. I'll be trying to finish up the details on the Palolo project. In terms of the archives, in terms of what the different paths are, different themes that people can follow. I promise I'll get that done by this afternoon. I'll post it in the first part, which has the Palolo project description in it. So that'll be an added file. I'll send you a notice that that's now up. And that'll give you a little more idea of the specifics. Again, don't worry about getting into it right away. As I think I pointed out last time, Candace was just telling me yesterday that she's now got, I think, 55 more nursing students that need to do the project. So we're now talking about somewhere like, I don't know, I lost track. I think she's thinking we have like 130 people that have to do something, which strikes me as being absolutely insane. So I'm going to pawn them off on something that I don't want to deal with. Oh, I didn't say that. I'm going to give them something else to do. And so that you guys will have the main choice. So I'll give you that, which includes at least some initial sources and stuff, and then you can look through that and figure out which of these things sounds most interesting. And do think about it. If you don't see what you've got up in that list I'll give you, feel free to propose something else that you want to look at that ties into this particular area. There's a bunch of stuff I haven't thought about, like last night, something dawned on me, we could do something related to education in this part of the island that I haven't even thought about and what that would look like. So don't worry about it, but I'll get you that up and do try to take a look at it by, is today Thursday? It is, right? Damn.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
For a second, I was thinking it was Tuesday. I was thinking, shit. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I shouldn't use that language. So look at that. Try to look at that thing when I get it done. Look at it by Tuesday, and that way, if you got any ideas or you want to set up, I want to do this or I want to do that, then we can start into that. So you're not on the clock for it yet, but it'll give you a chance to think about it when you got a little bit of time. Okay. Anything else that I missed that I should go over?
Professor, I had a question.
Sure.
So it was about the violent Hawaii reaction video. So
Yeah.
I guess in the question that you said you're gonna go over the stereotypes. Do we have to find on the reading, or are you gonna like post something about it?
Well, actually, I was sort of talked about that. If you think about that whole European view of Polynesians,
Okay.
and especially the view of Hawaii, if Hawaii is part of this Eden or paradise, notice how that's actually, if you watch the video, the way that they talk about, oh, it's so surprising that you could have violent things happen in Hawaii. If you're, I was an archaeologist for a little while in Oregon. You never see anyone walking around Oregon going like, oh no, violent things could happen here. It's like, no shit. So why would that be a thing that you can actually do a video on if you have it happen in Hawaii? Now you guys classically see this. You flash back to when tourism was still going on. The number of folks that you'd see there out at the North Shore that would stand there in the middle of a 30-foot wave and try to have a selfie done with their back facing the wave and get their ass kicked. Or the folks that would swim out and try to play with a shark. Which if you're me and you grew up in that type of world, it's sort of like, dude, you do not want to pull on a 6-foot tiger shark and see what the reaction's going to be. Now, in most cases, you'd think that same person, if they were walking around in the mainland, they've seen a large bear, it might dawn on them, you don't want to like poke it and see what it's going to do. But of course, part of the problem you get into here in Hawaii is people very frequently think, oh, it's paradise, it's Eden. Nothing bad can happen here. So I can go walk on a ridge in the middle of the rain and I won't fall. I can go and grab a puffer fish and it won't poke me. I can do all sorts of stupid crap and no be any response because of course in paradise, no bad things can happen to you. It's like somehow they think that paradise and Eden are sort of like Disneyland. And that's to a certain extent when you watch that video, if you listen to the way they do the music, for example, if you listen to the way the guys do the narration, it's like, wow, this is so surprising. If you think about it for a second, why would surfing a 30-foot wave be surprising that it's dangerous? I've seen at least 35-foot waves out of Hawai'i. Those things are incredibly impressive, but I was not in God's green earth, I would take my canoe up there. Unless I was feeling suicidal for about 10 seconds, because that's about how long it would take to disappear. So why someone is thinking that's what it is sort of part of that. So that whole video is based, when you have to remember their audience was the mainland United States. That whole audience is based, and the whole video is based on this idea of actually talking about those stereotypes, but not directly. It's just sort of assuming that everyone's got that stereotyped view. So it's sort of trippy when you watch that, especially if you listen to the music. Music is, that thing's pretty non-subtle in spots. It's sort of like whacking someone with a hammer. But it's fascinating because it says a lot, and that's what I'm trying to get you guys sensitized to. Is there's a lot of sort of implicit assumptions in a lot of the stuff we're going to see that you don't think about until you're sort of going like, oh, that seems sort of rude, or oh yeah, that's right. So.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Oh, and for assignments, do we usually email you it?
Yeah. Or else I can do whatever the text response is in Canvas. Either way works.
Okay, all right. Thank
and
you.
You'll just for the reactions, you're just going to get it okay. In most cases, I won't really respond back to unless a couple of folks had something interesting they wanted to add. They were actually asking a question. But usually I just give you an okay. That just means that I've got it in your grade sheet. Because you guys can see your grade sheets in Canvas. At least you could last semester, I'm sure you can. So when I've actually looked at what you've entered in, you'll end up with a mark or whatever the percentage or whatever it is for having done the assignment. Because remember the reactions, you just get rated for doing them.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Anything else? We good for a Thursday? Okay, we good for a Thursday?
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay, I guess on that note, stop recording.